Welcome to People Behind the Science. I'm Dr. Marie McNeely, and I am thrilled to have you joining me today to celebrate our 650th episode of the show. Listeners, our guest today is Dr. Nicholas Oberlies. And as you know, through our podcast, we are working to demystify science, scientists, and science careers. And if you support our mission and want to support our program, you can donate through our crowdfunding campaign at patreon.com/sciencepodcast, or visit the support page of our website at peoplebehindthescience.com/support. We truly appreciate all of the wonderful people who have helped us over the years continue sharing the stories of inspirational scientists. And in today's interview, Nick has some excellent stories of his own to share. So get ready to meet another one of our fantastic people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Nick Oberlies. So, Nick, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're looking forward to learning more about you and your work. But before we jump into the details, let me first start by telling our listeners a little bit about your current position and how you got there. So listeners, Nick is the Patricia A. Sullivan Distinguished Professor of Chemistry and Graduate Director in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. He was awarded his bachelor's degree in chemistry from Miami University in Ohio and his Ph.D. in Medicinal Chemistry and Pharmacognosy from Purdue University. Afterwards, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship at American Cyanamid. He then joined the National Products Laboratory at Research Triangle Institute, rising through the ranks to become director of the Natural Products Laboratory. Nick joined the faculty at UNC Greensboro in 2009. He has received various awards and honors throughout his career, including the Matt Suffness Young Investigator Award from the American Society of Pharmacognosy, the 40 Under 40 Leadership Award from the Triangle Business Journal, and the North Carolina Distinguished Speaker Award from the NC section of the American Chemical Society. And Nick, today we're excited to learn more about you as a scientist, of course, but also more about you as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Actually, I have a lot of other interests, I would say. But of course, like a lot of scientific geeks, I read books a lot, things like that. But the other things I like to do are either sports, exercise, stuff like that. I still play soccer. I've been playing soccer for about 45 years of my life. Not very well, but I still try to play. I run, try to stay in shape. And I enjoy music a lot. I try to play guitar. I think with my sports and my music, though, I should emphasize that I try. Mm-hmm. Science is my real gig. I just try those other things, do my best at it.
I like it. I think you don't have to be necessarily good at sports or music to enjoy them. So
yeah, exactly.
Now, you mentioned books as well, and that's a topic we love covering on our program. So do you have any particular books that you have really enjoyed that you want to recommend for me and our listeners to add to our own reading lists?
You know, I could tell you two. One is more in the weeds of what I do as a scientist, which is it's a book called The Mold in Dr. Florey's Coat. It's one of those pulp science kind of books written by a guy named Eric Lax, which effectively goes through the discovery of penicillin. And what I like about it is that many people know Alexander Fleming. I mean, even just your average person on the street might know who Alexander Fleming was. And Fleming did the work to get the organism and make the observation, the penicillium. But the people who really did the chemistry behind that during the middle of World War II, during the time that London was being bombed, are a series of scientists who also shared the Nobel Prize with Fleming. And Lax goes through that in his book. So that would be one. The other is I have kids, they're teenagers, and sometimes it's hard to connect maybe with your daughter sometimes when they're going through their teenage years. So I used to try to read the same book she was reading. And I really enjoyed some of the sort of young adult fiction, particularly a book called Cinder by Marissa Myers. It's kind of a spin on Cinderella, but set in the 23rd century or something like that. It's kind of got a science fiction spin, but it's still a really good story.
Oh, cool. Well, we look forward to adding both of these book recommendations to our list on our website for our listeners to find there. You mentioned that you've got these hobbies, but science is your main gig. So I'd love to talk about your science next. So you're in a particular niche field here that people may have trouble understanding all the details. So how do you describe what you do to someone who's not in science?
Most people don't even know the word pharmacognosy. So you make a great point. Mm-hmm. But effectively, we're the people who try to discover medicines from nature. And many people think of their medicines as You go to the local pharmacy and the pharmacist hands you something. And what you might not realize is how many of those drugs, both behind the counter and over the counter. And I should clarify, I'm not talking about the herbal remedies, although we do some studies on herbal remedies as well. But I'm talking about like what a pharmacist would hand you. Antibiotics, anti-cancer drugs, pain medicines, et cetera, are often either originally from nature or more likely the compound was originally discovered from nature and then somebody made some slight tweaks to it to perhaps enhance its solubility or its stability or to enhance a patent position, things like that. But many, many, many ideas come from nature. In fact, I think in the average pharmacy in the United States, about 25% of the drugs are originally discovered from nature. And if you get down to the anti-infective and anti-cancer space, it's more like 65, almost 70% of the drugs are from originally ideas that came from nature. So we're the guys in my lab. I'm not an MD. I'm the guy, and my research team really is working on trying to discover compounds from fungi that will affect cancer in a positive way for humans. So basically kill the cancer.
Very cool. And it sounds like you draw a lot of your inspiration, of course, for the work that you do from nature. And I think this can be really motivational and inspirational for scientists who are working in, the fields of biology, chemistry, things like that. But when you think about motivational quotes or sayings, do you personally have a mantra, Nick, or something that goes through your head that keeps you motivated and inspired in the work you do?
I love motivational quotes. It's sometimes hard to come up with them on the fly. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like when somebody says, be funny.
Right.
But I can tell you two that come to mind really quickly. One is an Einstein quote, and many, many people come to it, which is in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. And in fact, I have like a little plaque of that so my students can look at it. And I think of that both as a professor where you've got students coming down to you sort of saying like, I don't know if I can make this thing work, or it's not working, or it's broken, or whatever their issue is in the science. And you can just think, well, okay, if it was easy, someone would already figured it out. But I also then try to think about it more for myself when you have like hard lucks in science, like you don't win the grant, the idea didn't work, the paper didn't get published. Okay, well, what can we do to make this better? So that's one of them. I do have a second one, which is actually from a book. I think it's called Life's Little Instruction Book by H. Jackson Brown, which is don't major in minor things. That doesn't mean like what you study in college. I'm certainly guilty of this. It's like getting hung up on some little tiny detail and maybe losing sight of the big picture. So I try to really think about like, wait a minute, let's remember at the end of the day, we're trying to come up with cancer drugs here. Let's focus on that. And then, okay, we'll figure out these little details, but don't let it derail our studies.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's such a really helpful quote for scientists and for kind of people at large, because it's so easy to get caught up in those nitty gritty details and lose sight of the big picture, and just reframing that perspective can be so helpful to get through a sort of a conundrum you're stuck in.
Absolutely. The trick to that is to like remember it yourself. It's easy as the professor to say to the 20-year-old student, all right, don't major in that, like focus, move on. But then to like remember it myself when I'm dinging around with emails or dinging around with some like little thing, like, wait a minute, let's get back to the science here.
Well, Nick, I think those are wonderful motivational quotes. And I know over the course of your career as a scientist, you get to work with so many inspiring, motivating, really wonderful people. And I think this is part of the reason the careers are so exciting and so fun. So when you think back over the course of your own career, are there people who really rise to the top of your mind as people who had a big impact on you as mentors or role models?
I think an important point to make is that like there's many, many, many mentors over the years. I can think of 4 really quickly, and it points to like maybe where I am today. But in high school, I had a really good chemistry teacher, Mrs. Walsh. I didn't even realize it till later that she had a master's in chemistry. And I think that gave me a foundation that allowed me then to succeed in college. When I was at Miami University, I did undergraduate research with a person named Mike Novak. He's retired now, but and the funny thing is, if you ever talk to somebody from Miami University and you say, yeah, I worked with Mike Novak, they would look at you like, oh my God, he was a tough guy. I mean, and he really was. So we didn't have this like warm, fuzzy relationship. In fact, I think he always referred to me as Oberlies. Oberlies, what are you doing? That kind of thing. But he's the guy who said to me, if you want to be a chemist, you ought to do undergraduate research. Way back in the early 90s, that wasn't the thing that it is today. A lot of students do undergraduate research, but it really sort of set me on my way. And I think also he really taught me to be confident in my chemistry. That's why I kind of talk about like, I'm an okay guitar player. I'm a decent runner. I'm not great at it, but I don't think I'm a great chemist, but I'm a competent chemist. He made me competent in what I am. In graduate school, of course, my mentor was a guy named Jerry McLaughlin. The great thing about Dr. McLaughlin is that he was like a junkyard dog. Like he was just really scrappy and always real resourceful and really supported his people, always supported his people. people who needed visas, people who had all kinds of trouble. I remember even one time that one of the custodial staff at Purdue had some sort of problems and he was helping her out. So he was a real support the people person. And then scientifically, I would say probably the biggest influence would be my mentors when I was at Research Triangle Institute, which is Drs. Monroe Wall and Mansukh Wani, who both are no longer with us, but they're the people who discovered a molecule called Taxol, which is one of the number one drugs for the treatment of breast and ovarian cancer. They also discovered another compound called camptothecin. And I always kind of joke that they're like the Batman and Robin of natural products research. Very few of us discover a compound that makes it all the way to a drug, and even fewer do it twice. And there were a lot of things, particularly Dr. Wall. When I first joined, I was probably 28 years old and he was close to 80. I knew this was the end of the line for him, I think. And I would spend hours in his lab listening to stories about how he got into projects and how they moved things forward. And he was always about the team. This is where I would sort of contrast Dr. McLaughlin, my graduate advisor, with Dr. Wall, my postdoc advisor, in that McLaughlin would try to figure out things and how to do it on his own, which there's credit to that. You learn a lot that way. But if you really want to push something, what you ought to do is go find the world's experts. Be expert in what you do. Be an expert natural product chemist. But if you want to study the cancer pharmacology, then go collaborate with an MD, Ph.D. who is an expert in breast cancer or ovarian cancer, whatever you're trying to push it in. Yeah, he was really about building the team. The interesting thing about him is he had his PhD before World War II.
Oh, wow.
So if you think about the perspective of somebody who got his PhD in like 37 or 38 or 39 up through, I think he passed away in the early 2000s, like there's a lot of history there you can learn. And even though science changes a lot, the thing that's consistent is it's people doing science, right? So the people are the consistency. So just always try to work really well with people, I think, is what I learned from them.
Definitely. Well, Nick, it sounds like you've had some tremendous mentors over the years. And you mentioned that already in your high school years, you were getting interested in chemistry with this phenomenal teacher that you had in high school. So if you maybe walk us back to the beginning, can you recall when you first started getting interested in science, or maybe specifically in chemistry?
I always tell people that I never had a chemistry kit. I was never that kid who's got the story about setting their parents' basement on fire. Mm-hmm. I was the guy who at a very early age, my uncle gave me a subscription to a little magazine for kids. It was basically National Geographic. I think it was called National Geographic World. And my parents got National Geographic. And I'm in my 50s. I still read National Geographic cover to cover. So I was the guy who was always into kind of exploring things. I love those stories about the first person to climb Mount Everest and put the flag in the ground, or the person who does it faster, the person who goes to the deepest part of the ocean. Maybe that speaks a little bit to doing natural products chemistry, because you're often the first to describe some organism or the first to describe some molecule. So yeah, I would say that my early career was definitely influenced by just this kind of discovery, this want to do discovery. And then the chemistry spiel is I grew up in Indianapolis. And what your listeners might not know is that Eli Lilly and Company, which is a major pharmaceutical company, is in Indianapolis and has been there certainly more than 100 years. And if you happen to be good in chemistry as a high school kid, everybody you talk to will say, well, you're going to go work for Eli Lilly, right? I mean, when I say everybody, I mean, of course, yeah, your teachers and whatnot, but I mean like your soccer coach. My grandfather, who never finished 8th grade, let alone high school, would always say, oh, son, go knock on the door of Eli Lilly. Tell him your papa sent you. And the funny thing is I never ever worked for Eli Lilly, but as a young man, I went to college with the thought of going to work for Eli Lilly. In fact, when I was deciding where to go to graduate school, I got a hold of a list of the schools that Eli Lilly recruited from, which not surprisingly were those in the Big Ten. And then, of course, Harvard's and the West Coast. But that was my goal. Discovery, pharmaceuticals, those kind of things is what kind of got me interested in what I'm doing today.
Oh, that's so cool. So then what maybe changed that trajectory for you and maybe turned the tide so that you didn't end up applying or working at Eli Lilly?
The funny thing about natural products research is even when I was probably less than 30 years old, people would say that I was like the last of the dinosaurs. If you look at the list of your show, like you've got people who do metabolomics and proteomics and all the omic-y sort of things. And natural products seems like this old science, which, I mean, I guess it's rooted in old science because people have been using nature for millennia to treat disease. But we use all the modern tools. It's just what we apply it to that perhaps looks a little bit old. But the funny thing is this person introduced me once at a conference saying that I was the last of the dinosaurs. It's one of those things where she didn't realize how much she was insulting me. But the reason why I never worked for Eli Lilly is because I got my PhD in 97. And at that time, they were kind of getting out of the natural products gig, as many pharmaceutical companies have. And instead, what pharmaceutical companies do is they acquire biotechs and things like that who have pushed natural products forward. So natural products has got this huge resurgence where people are realizing that like, oh, we need to find more drugs to treat all of these diseases. I mean, COVID's a great example. If you had anything to treat COVID, people would be really into that. So going back to your question, I know I'm rambling. Why didn't I end up working for Eli Lilly? Well, all through college and all through graduate school, I was always the guy who was going to go work in industry. And then my very first gig was in industry. And I realized I didn't like it. What I didn't like was it felt like, especially at the end of the 1990s, it felt like somebody had a giant Excel sheet and was just looking at the numbers and making decisions on what people were going to do scientifically. It wasn't science anymore. It was, we're going to make a profit this way. And I didn't like that. When I started at Research Triangle Institute, one of the things Dr. Wall said to me was, you can do anything you want with two caveats. And he meant anything. I mean, you could go do any science you wanted as long as it was ethical. And people always laugh about that, but you have to remember that RTI was founded in the early 1960s when you could have gotten money from tobacco companies, especially in North Carolina, to say, well, smoking's not so bad for you. So it had to be ethical, but more importantly, you had to get funding for it. It was a private nonprofit. One of the people in charge of RTI used to joke that even though we're not for profit, we're also not for loss. So you had to bring in money to support yourself and you could do your science. And over the years, I just kind of kept marching more and more towards this academic pursuit. And in 2009, I had an opportunity to move to academia where UNC Greensboro was starting a Ph.D. program. I kind of had gotten some nostalgia for training people. I was kind of moving more and more towards an academic model, more and more towards just doing a little bit more basic research. I'm kind of one of those strange people who ended up in academia in a very sort of backdoor sort of way. But it's been great. I love it.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm so glad you shared the story because I think you often hear the inverse where people are so set on an academic career and they end up in industry for various reasons. But I think this contrary example where you're like, all right, I was so set on industry and ended up back in academia, I think is really cool.
That's funny. I often have this dream that someday Eli Lilly will hire me as a consultant so I can at least cross that off the list since I had always said I wanted to work there. But that's a different story.
Oh, that is phenomenal. Well, you've shared a little bit about your path in terms of how you got to where you are today at UNC Greensboro, but I'd love to dive into the details of your lab. So, Nick, is there a particular project that you've got in the works at the moment that you are just the most excited about that you'd like to share with us?
Our largest project is supported by the National Cancer Institute. It's part of a very big partnership, many universities, many different players. As I said, I'm into this idea of working with other people where we are studying fungi for anti-cancer drug leads. I should clarify, when I say fungi, I don't mean mushrooms. I mean fungi that you can grow in the laboratory. Not too different than Alexander Fleming trying to discover penicillin back in the day, but we're doing it to discover anti-cancer drug leads. And we've been doing this in collaboration for more than a decade now. But the thing that makes me excited recently is our ability to modify and manipulate those organisms to produce molecules on a larger scale. One of the challenges in natural products research is you often don't have enough material to go forward. Classic examples of a molecule that you'd have to cut. Taxol is a great example. In the early days of Taxol research, you would have had to cut down a 300 to 400-year-old tree, extract all the Taxol from it to treat one patient one time, right? And most patients go through 6 rounds of chemotherapy. So you can see how that's like not sustainable. Eventually, some very great scientists figured out ways to get around that. So one of the cool things about working with fungi that you can grow in the laboratory is that you can grow them in the laboratory and you can figure out ways to modify their growth conditions to enhance the production of certain molecules. And so suddenly, once you have more material in hand, then there's a whole bunch of other things you can do. You can try to figure out, can we make the molecule more soluble? One of my collaborators who's an expert in pharmacology will say, well, Nick, I thought all the best anti-cancer drugs got really poor solubility, which is true. But it's got to have a certain level of solubility so that they can actually treat people. So once you have enough material in hand, you can tweak the solubility parameters. You can try to modify the molecule. You can try to explore it in different ways. So I would say some of the neatest things we're doing most recently is probably about 4 or 5 of our best leads. After going through thousands of fungal cultures, after isolating hundreds and hundreds of compounds, probably 4 or 5 of our best leads, we're trying to optimize their growth conditions and get them into our hands so that we can provide them to a bunch of collaborators who then do their science to make the molecule go into solution better or make the molecule have a longer half-life if you treat a patient with it. So that's kind of where we are now. We're kind of in those early stages of preclinical development.
Oh, very cool. And I think just this task of identifying potential molecules that could be used for drug treatments seems so daunting to me. I mean, there's so many different fungi species out there. There are so many different ones that maybe do or do not grow well in laboratory environments. How do you even approach this problem and start to decide what you're going to work on next?
There are so many fungi in the world. It's been estimated that there's somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 million fungi in the world. And I always joke it doesn't matter because less than 150,000 have been studied. So everywhere we go, we discover new ones. From a training perspective, if you want to get a student interested in science, it's great to go out and do field work. So we go off and do collections. It was spring break here last week at UNCG. So I took a bunch of my grad students out to a local state park and collected samples. We're often trying to look where other people don't. That's kind of that whole in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. The fungi that grow really fast are the penicilliums and the aspergillus, the ones that we know a lot about for the past 100 years. So we're trying to find the ones that are from an environment that most people don't look at. Sometimes that is an aquatic environment, such as freshwater aquatic fungi. Sometimes we are looking at fungi that no one even knows really what the name of it is. So we've got to figure out the taxonomy behind it. I don't know if that really answers your question, but there's a little bit of statistics to it. Like we'll go through hundreds and hundreds of cultures a year. And the kind of classic thing about natural products research, which some people will critique, is that jokingly they'll call it grind and find. You go out and you just grind through hundreds and hundreds of samples, and you'll find 3 to 5% do something to a bioassay that you're interested in, no matter what that bioassay is, whether it's anti-cancer, anti-infective, or does it look pretty? Does it smell good? Does it smell bad? Whatever you want to call the bioassay, about 3 to 5% will probably hit that. And when we get to that 3 to 5%, then we spend a lot of time really digging through it and trying to prioritize the samples that make chemistry we have not studied before. That's kind of the magic to what we're doing is like, okay, focus on these over here because they're making some chemistry that could be unique. Or back to what I was talking about earlier, where I said that we're trying to scale up samples, try to find additional strains that make the same compounds that you're interested in so that you can do strain optimization, go through a whole bunch of strains and figure out which one makes it the best. Now, that's kind of what humans have been doing to figure out yeast to bake bread and ferment beers and wines and whatnot. Like there's thousands and thousands of yeast out there. But some of them are a little bit better, right? We call that baker's yeast. People have kind of figured that out empirically. Well, we're kind of doing the same thing in the laboratory.
Very interesting. And it sounds like there's a really long road from that point of discovery all the way to pushing things out to becoming a successful drug. And of course, a lot of hurdles and challenges and things along the way, many of which you've experienced yourself. So I'd love to talk about these challenges and struggles and failures because I think every scientist has them and you don't necessarily know what you're getting into when you're this young student beginning your scientific career. So Nick, can you tell us about one of your major struggles and how you worked through it?
One of the major challenges is keeping the lab funded. So I spend a lot of my time writing grants and writing proposals and staying tenacious with it, like not taking no for an answer. So getting the money to do the research is really a major challenge. You cannot underemphasize that point. You know, the other challenges that we come across, I can tell you very early in my career, I made a mistake on a project where I had a collaboration that wasn't going well and eventually really exploded in a bad way, like sleepless nights kind of thing. I mean, everything turned out fine in the end, but I think the big lesson I learned from that is I jokingly have this comment that everybody I work with has to have pass a drink a beer test. And if my wife were here, she would say, now make it clear that you don't mean drink beer. Yes, I don't mean drink beer. But what I mean by that is if you're going to work with a bunch of scientists, a lot of these collaborations, they're handshake agreements. Somebody at a university in Chicago will say, yeah, we'd like to work with you. Or somebody at a university around the world would like to work with you. And there's no exchange of money. It's all done based on your promise to help them and their promise to help you. And you want everybody to come to the table equally and like that. And I think a mistake I made early in my career was, you know, in a world where you can do everything with email or Twitter, whatever, text messages, you still need to sit down and talk to people. This is the thing that has killed me during COVID is that this lack of ability to go to conferences, this lack of ability to visit universities, this lack of ability to just go meet with people and give seminars. I feel very starved by that because I'm the guy who likes to sit there and talk to people for a long period of time and get to know them. And I always say that if you can't sit around with somebody and have a conversation about anything else other than their science, then maybe, this is just me, maybe that's not someone I should be collaborating with because I've got other interests. I want to know about your family. I want to know about what else you like to do for fun because the science is really hard. Most of the time it doesn't work. And the constant of science, again, going back to my Dr. Wall example, who had a Ph.D. before World War II, the constant in science is the people. whether those are people that you're directly collaborating with or the students in the lab or people that you're working with on a funding basis. So you got to get to know those people. And scientists, my wife would jokingly say, like, which one of you scientists isn't a little socially awkward, right? So the drink a beer test is basically, can you sit down and talk to somebody about something other than just their science? And yes, I like to drink beer, so we'll have a beer. But if perhaps, if you don't drink, if for religious reasons you don't drink, or
you prefer tea, water, whatever your beverage of choice.
Yeah, whatever it is. Exactly. Yeah. Like it's not really drinking the beer. It's the point of like sitting down and having a meal, having a conversation, those kind of things. One of the classes I teach at UNC Greensboro is public speaking for chemists, basically trying to teach them how to go out and give seminars. And it's a class they take their last semester at UNCG. And we have a lot of first generation college students on our campus and a lot of non-traditional students. And I try to turn that class into, let me tell you how to go get a job. Let me tell you how to interview. Let me tell you, someday somebody's going to ask you to go out to dinner. What are you going to order? And you could see this look of horror in some of the kids' faces who will go,
don't get the spaghetti.
Yeah, don't order spaghetti. Yeah. Don't order lasagna. Don't get anything on your tie. Okay. But I try to point out to them, like, again, people get all hung up in the science, but really, if somebody hires you, they're hiring you to like be a colleague. So be a colleague.
I love that. And I think it's so important because, as you alluded to, these are the people, your collaborators, the colleagues that you're working with, who you're going to be celebrating the exciting successes with, but also the people who be supporting you when things don't go as well. So you do want to make sure that you build the best team around you that you can. So I think that's a wonderful story for our listeners. But we don't just want to talk about the tough times and how to make it through them, though I think there are many in science. We'd love to talk about your successes as well. So Nick, when you think about your own experiences, is there a big win that was really meaningful for you, or even just a small victory that happened recently that you want to share with us?
Well, we like to publish lots of papers. I tell students that I think publications are like the currency of science. My research group's about 15 people, and there's always new students coming in and students graduating. And I try to make this point that, like, why do we publish our papers? Well, we publish papers because that's how we advertise. I mean, that's the way. Yes, we can send out tweets and all kinds of things, but really you want people to read your scientific papers. So most recently, we had a paper published in the Journal of Organic Chemistry, which is an American Chemistry Society journal. That's not a place I've published very often in my career. I've published more than 200 papers. I think there's only 2 or 3 in that journal. And that felt really good. But what was really nice was about, 3 weeks after the publication came out, just randomly in my email, I get a thing from the American Chemical Society that says, oh, these are the top 4 or 5 downloaded papers in a certain journal. And so I got the one that said, okay, this is the top 4 or 5 papers in the Journal of Organic Chemistry. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's our paper.
Oh, wow.
That feels pretty good when it's only been up for about a month. So that felt really good. That was probably the most recent victory that we've had.
Oh, that is phenomenal. So how do you celebrate these kinds of wins in the lab?
I would have to say, like I mentioned, that we went out and did a hike recently because we had beautiful weather, and I took everyone afterwards out for some ice cream. So I think maybe that was our little bit of our victory dance, was like, let's take the afternoon off, go collect some samples, enjoy the good weather and the atmosphere in North Carolina, and just enjoy hanging out with each other while we eat some ice cream.
Oh, that is phenomenal. And I think getting out of the lab is wonderful to kind of change your perspective, get out in nature, particularly if you're gaining inspiration from nature in the work that you do. But also just in general, traveling for science is something that's a really great opportunity for students as well as kind of throughout your career as a professor. So when you look at all the places that your science has taken you, whether it was for field work or for conferences or to meet with collaborators, Nick, is there a particular place that really sticks out in your mind as one that was the most memorable for you?
Well, that is one of the great benefits of being an academic, is traveling. If you like travel, is going around and seeing places. So I've been to a lot of places. I've been to Korea, and I've been to, the last place I went before the world closed was Taiwan. It's not a place many people go to. That was fun. Probably the most memorable is I had a collaboration. I still have a collaboration with some colleagues in Jordan. So I actually had a grant in the early 2000s to do some field work in Jordan. So spent 10 days wandering around Jordan, like Lawrence of Arabia, collecting samples and things like that. That was a really good experience, and probably speaks to the whole people component of science. Like, how did I end up in Jordan? Well, in graduate school, I had a colleague. We were at the lab bench together. We weren't even really the greatest of friends, but we respected each other, who was studying at Purdue on a scholarship from the government of Jordan. And the deal was, when he finished up his Ph.D., he had to go back to Jordan to be a professor. And many years later, I had this kind of wild idea to do some field work. I don't know whose quote this is. I like to often say that, like, when everybody zigs, I like to zag. I don't know, maybe that's my quote, but somebody must have said that before me. But we had a collaboration where our grant application where it was specific for natural products research. And you can imagine if people are going to do natural products research, you could just sort of like spin the globe around the equator and say, okay, well, someone should go to Costa Rica and someone should go to Panama and someone should go to Indonesia, et cetera. And people were doing those things. And what I did is I wrote the grant that said, okay, yeah, but we're going to go to Jordan. And in people's mind, you think deserts and a place where there's not much water, but that doesn't mean there's not biodiversity. So I contacted this guy who I hadn't spoke to in years and set up a collaboration in Jordan. And I had to go around, as part of this collaboration, I had to get a bunch of permissions to collect in the country. This is a very important thing in natural products research. You can't just go collect a sample. You need permission to do so. So when I go to state parks in North Carolina, I have permission to collect in the state parks. So to wander around Jordan, I needed to get permission. And we had to go talk to like the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health and the Minister of the Environment. And a funny thing happened is that as we're going to all these different places, it was amazing to me the number of people in Jordan who had graduated from a Big Ten school, or more specifically, had graduated from Purdue. I was literally in the middle of Amman, Jordan one day, talking to a guy about where he grew up in Indianapolis because his father had worked for Eli Lilly and he had graduated from Purdue.
Small world.
My goodness. I'm in the middle of Amman talking about the northwest side of Indy. Anyway, crazy story. So I would say that the Jordan experience has been really interesting and actually really fruitful. We have a lot of students who over the years, then after the buildup of that collaboration, have then come to UNCG to train. There must be 4 or 5, maybe more professors now in Jordan who all got their PhDs here at UNCG. Interestingly, all of those are women that we've gone back to train to be professors there. So very proud of that, actually.
Oh, that is wonderful. And I'm curious, what does fieldwork look like for your group? Are you going around with Petri dishes? You mentioned you don't necessarily focus on mushrooms. So how are you finding these samples, or what are you looking for out in the field?
When we're doing field work, like I'll give you the example of collecting in a state park, we're often looking at what are called freshwater fungi. So fungi that inhabit the water, so streams, ponds, whatnot. And the way we collect those samples is we've got like little wader boots and we'll walk into the stream and we'll basically pick up sticks. Fungi effectively decompose things in the environment. So we are looking for a piece of wood that has what you would call soft rot. So if you pick up the stick and it bends really easily, you throw it back. But if you pick up a stick and you sort of try to bend it and it just sort of flies apart, that's because of lignases and cellulases and other things that fungi have in them that are decomposing that wood as their food source. So we sort of look for those things. We try to go to places that are a little more pristine, try to go away from where people might be. But we'll basically pick up those samples. We put them in little Ziploc bags and bring them back to the lab. And I've got a great colleague who's a mycologist in the lab who will then pull out those pieces of wood. We kind of put them like in a Tupperware container for a long period of time. We've kept them in those things for more than a year, 13, 15, 16 months, things like that. And about once a month, once every 6 weeks, he'll pull them out and look at them under the microscope. And what he's looking for kind of looks like a mushroom. He's looking for something that grows out of the wood that is indicative of a fungus growing there. And we then lance those things and pull the spores out. So going back to your question about field work, what does the field work look like? Well, we are writing down GPS coordinates. We're writing down the temperature. We're maybe taking the temperature of the water. We might be taking the pH of the water. We'll probably take a few pictures, and then we're collecting some sticks. That's basically it. And then bring it back to the lab. A great lesson for students, by the way, is that a day of field work can lead to years of research in the lab. I mean, quite literally years. So a lot of students, maybe they're like me and they read National Geographic and love those photos of Jane Goodall out there looking at chimpanzees and whatnot. But I imagine, yes, that looks cool with her out there noting what the chimpanzees are doing. But then she goes back and works for hours making notes and transcribing her notes and writing papers. That's the thing you got to teach students, that it's not all just sitting there enjoying the nature. You got to bring it back to the lab and do some real work.
I love it. Well, it sounds like this was a fantastic opportunity to get out in the field into a part of the world that you might not otherwise have traveled to. So was fieldwork in Jordan, I guess, different than some of the experiences you've had at other places?
Yeah, it really was. You're in the desert. I even once put in a grant. Somebody was critiquing our grant to study in Jordan. And I kind of pick up on this fact that they thought it was just a big sandbox. Everybody's seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, right? They think, oh, it's just sand blowing around everywhere. But deserts are actually very biodiverse and very understudied. Jordan is also where the Dead Sea is. So that's like the lowest place on Earth, high salinity environment. So there's a lot of neat things you can look at. Is it different? Yeah. Like I remember we were in a Jeep driving around Wadi Rum with a ranger, and he's driving us out to where we were looking. At this time, we were looking for a plant sample, and we had a botanist with us. And I remember as we're driving along, I'm looking at the ground, wondering, what is that? And I realize, oh, those are camel hoof prints. I'm used to deer prints and dog prints, right, collected in North Carolina, but those are from a camel. And when you dig a sample in the desert, like if we were going to study a plant sample, you got to dig really deep, not surprisingly, right? Because they've got to get their roots way down there. So yeah, those were sort of neat aspects of it. There's a little bit the Wild West too, in that professors are highly respected in Jordan, as they are in many countries. But we could go many places where I thought to myself, my colleague's name was Faraz. I'd say, Faraz, are we allowed to go here? He goes, oh, let me go talk to that person. And he would talk to him and comment about where he's a professor. And suddenly, woof, you guys do whatever you want. Collect what you want.
That is phenomenal. It's so cool to hear about these different experiences that scientists have had all over the world and how things are a little bit different in different countries. But there's also, I think, threads that tie everything together. And I think one of these threads is just, as you alluded to, the people in science, these connections that you make that are truly without borders here. And I think oftentimes scientists are portrayed a particular way in the media, and we try to break some of those stereotypes. Scientists aren't necessarily these super critical, thinking about science all the time sorts of people. Many of the scientists I've met are some of the funniest and most creative people I know. So do you have stories or examples from your own experiences, Nick, that you can share of this human side of science, whether it's funny traditions or memories or things that you've shared with colleagues?
I can tell you a funny tradition. One of the students in Jordan, the first student who came in to work with me from Jordan, her name was Tamam, and she was extremely prolific. She was a little bit older when she got here. And I think the other thing that probably your listeners can appreciate is that being a female scientist and going back to Jordan, there's going to be some bias probably. And so I think she felt like she needed to get a lot of work done here. Like she showed up and rolled up her sleeves, so to speak, and got the work done. In fact, I can tell you a funny story. Like right next to our building is an apartment complex. And I remember when she was moving here, I was trying to help her find a place. And she said, well, I want an apartment where I can like almost reach out and touch the building. And I said, oh, we've got that. So she was here all the time. Anyway, so her thesis is particularly thick. And a lot of people will look up to her for all the publications that she wrote. So we weighed it. And so we know how many grams her thesis weighs.
Oh, wow.
So sometimes when subsequent students finish up their Ph.D., particularly those in Jordan who know her well, they'll want to weigh theirs and see, does it weigh the same? And to date, nobody's got the same weight. She still beat them. My most recent graduate is another student from Jordan who I think was disappointed that she couldn't outweigh Tamam. But she said, I've got a couple more papers to publish. Maybe we can put those on top. I said, no, your thesis is your thesis. Let's weigh it. I've heard of other people who will take I don't do this with my students because I've got a lot of Muslim students. We don't really have alcohol in the lab because of like my drink a beer test, but we'll drink tea. But I've heard of other people who will take a champagne bottle and shake it up and see how far somebody can shoot the cork and measure the distance of the cork. I think that's kind of a funny tradition.
I like it. And of course, with the weight of the thesis, you can't cheat with like weighted paper or anything like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, double space or triple space. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a fantastic tradition, and I think speaks volumes, of course, of the quality of students that are coming through your lab and doing phenomenal work there. And I think you guys are addressing some really important questions and topics in science, I think particularly in light of the situation in the world today. So if funding, staff, technology, feasibility, these barriers that you normally face, Nick, were not a problem, is there one research question or one research topic that you would want to tackle first?
I mean, I love what I work on. I often joke that if I ever discovered the compound that becomes the multi-million-dollar drug, I would cash out, but I wouldn't cash out and stop doing science. I'd still do what I'm doing today. But I'll tell you, the other research problems that I think are really interesting and really pressing that I wouldn't mind getting into would certainly be about the environment. I mean, I think a little bit about solar energy, bioremediation, things like that. Coming up with enzymes. We actually have a new collaboration with a colleague in Germany where we know all this stuff about fungi and we know all this stuff about their chemistry. Could we figure out something about their enzymes that could be used in biofuels production or laundry detergents or whatever it is? So trying to use nature in a positive way. So I would say that it would be certainly something about nature, but it might be more of an environmental spin.
Oh, cool. And I think that's really remarkable, as you've sort of alluded throughout our conversation, that you're able to form these collaborations to sort of extend the reach and the portfolio of topics that your lab can cover through working with these collaborators who have expertise in different areas. So how do you feel like this has really impacted the trajectory of your career?
I'm not even sure I could measure it. Every collaboration has influenced me in some way. I collaborate with some colleagues who are experts in material science. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, a lot of natural products have really poor solubility. So a lot of times now I'm thinking about, okay, How can we put this natural products chemistry together with their material science to try to deliver a drug in a more effective manner? That is not something way back in 1992 when I started grad school that I would have ever said I would have worked on. Or my colleague, who's actually in the next office next to me, is kind of an expert in inorganic chemistry and is intrigued by some of our natural products compounds because they seem to absorb light in unique ways. And because they absorb light in unique ways, well, then maybe we can figure out ways how you can pass electrons around. And if you can pass electrons around, well, then that has to do with solar energy. Maybe, big maybe. Okay, so it's a huge step there. But so suddenly we've got a collaboration where we're trying to put together her expertise in inorganic and our expertise in natural products and another collaborator's expertise at a university down in Charlotte in material science. So I really like all that stuff, by the way. I think that's what keeps me interested. If I was just working on the meat and potatoes of natural products chemistry, I think I might get a little bored with it. Or not really bored. I would worry that I would get stale. So I think all these collaborations allow you to do new things.
Definitely. I think these conversations with colleagues and collaborators can spark new ideas and new directions for your research, but they can also be great sources of advice. So when you think back on your career, Nick, is there a piece of advice that you received from somebody at some point that really helped you that you can pay forward to our listeners today?
Again, it's never just one thing, but one thing I think a lot of people in the natural products field try to think about is take your science very seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously. Try not to have too much of an ego about things. Try not to worry too much about the awards and the recognition and the, whatever you want to say. There's many, many different kind of little awards. You very nicely pointed out some of the awards I've gotten over the years. I'm very thankful for those things. But I always joke that there's really only one award of science that anybody knows about, which is called the Nobel Prize. And I do not think I'm going to win the Nobel Prize someday. Okay. But that's the kind of thing, don't get too hung up in those things. Just do your science. Maybe that's a little bit older, a little bit more mature, Nick. As a young guy, I had a chip on my shoulder. I tried to get things done, tried to prove myself. But I think now what I think more about is just keep pushing that scientific envelope. Keep trying to push it back so that you can try to discover things. I think also because science is really hard, most days it doesn't work. People have to really appreciate that. Most days it doesn't work. So you have to do it because you love it.
Well, I think those are very important messages to pass on to our listeners. Nick, as our conversation comes to a close today, is there any other last piece of advice or last note of inspiration that you'd like to leave everybody with?
For students or people who think about they want to go into chemistry or just any science, I would say be passionate about it. Don't pick something because it's the latest, greatest technology, because someday it will be old. And don't get hung up in what somebody told you should study. Study something because you're passionate about it. One thing I tell my students is that you have to care more about your project than I do. And I care a lot. I spent hours in my office writing up the grant, submitting it God knows how many times to eventually win it so that we can go do this science. So I care a lot, but you got to care more about it. You got to be thinking about it all the time. So that'd be my advice to students. And if somebody is a parent out there, because I'm a parent, sometimes my lab goes in, this was pre-COVID, but we used to go to an elementary school and do something we called family science night, where we would show little experiments to kids, kindergarten through fifth grade, I think. And a lot of times parents will think about, well, I don't know if my kid's smart enough, or I don't know if they've got the patience for science, whatever it is. And I always tell people that I don't think smart exists. I don't know if that's really a thing, but I do think curiosity exists. I don't know how well your kid is doing in school, but if your kid is the one who's down at the creek with the stick and is trying to scratch something out and is trying to get that shell or that mollusk or that snail or whatever and brings it home and it's in their pockets, that kind of curiosity, that kind of hands-on thing, maybe science is for them. Maybe that would be a kind of a career path, or at least something that they could explore that would be interesting. So be curious.
I love it. Well, wonderful note to end on there, Nick. If our listeners want to learn more about you or the work your lab is doing, what is the best way for them to learn more?
One of the benefits of having the last name Oberlies and the first name Nicholas is there's not a lot of us, so especially as chemists. So if you just Google up my lab, Oberlies Research Group, you'll find me. And there's contact information on that page. And you can find our publications and talk to us. I love talking to people about science. They're welcome to contact me if they would like to.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out Nick's lab website and get in touch if you have any questions. And Nick, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was my great pleasure.
And while we've enjoyed our conversation, listeners, we are so happy to have you with us here as well. And we hope you'll join us on our next episode of People Behind the Science.